G'day ladies and gentlemen, ScottyD here from the Australia's Tabletop Wargaming Network, and welcome back for another installment in our From Sprue to Tabletop series. Alrighty everyone, welcome back to the ATWN with myself, ScottyD, here for the next installment in our From Sprue to Tabletop series. This is our series over here on YouTube where we go through hobbying tips, tricks, different processes, testing out different painting styles and the alike as well, and showcasing the variety of different ways that you can get your miniatures painted and onto the tabletop in a battle-ready style, or even more of that parade-ready style as well, if that is what your fancy. Now, before we jump into the content of today's video, I want to thank everyone who has been supporting us here on YouTube, where you've been liking our videos and tournament coverage, joining us for the live streams of said tournaments, or dropping comments in videos as well, or subscribing to the channel as well. All of it is greatly appreciated, and we really appreciate all of you guys showing us here at the ATWN some great patronage, and we're continuing to grow, which is absolutely phenomenal. Now let's jump in, because it's kind of been a bit of a while since I've done a From Sprue to Tabletop series, but I'm excited to pick this series back up and keep on going with where I did leave it off, because there's actually a lot going on for this series in the background that I've been working on. So whilst I've been continuing to prepare this orc force that I've been working on, cleaning up mold lines, getting bases ready for their new lease on life, ready to go, I actually decided to borrow some Tyranid von Rhein's Leapers off a mate of mine to test out some different contrast priming methods to see how the results are for contrast over those styles for myself, rather than just looking up what different creators have done and just go, oh yeah, that's what I'm going to go with. Kind of wanted to test it myself, get a bit of a handle on how to use the contrast paints and such as well, rather than just doing a whole bunch of research and then showing you guys the end results. I want to actually go through some testing and show you guys how I do that testing. Now, this is the first time I'll be working with contrast paints for entire miniatures. So I've kind of used them a little bit in the past for parts of models, but not the entirety of them. So I'm going to be really sharing my thoughts about the 3 different priming methods that I tested, how the paints felt, and everything on those lines, because each of the Von Rhein's Leapers, I only grabbed 3 in that unit, are going to be primed up in a different method and painted up using the same colors, so you can really see the difference. Now, the 3 different priming methods that I'm actually going to be testing in today's video is going to be the most popular ones that I've seen to be used, whether it's for contrast or general painting, and that is whether you're just using straight up grey Seer primer, or you're using black primer with a white Zenithal, or you're using the coined term by Rob the Honest Wargamer, the slapchop method, which is basically using a grey mid-tone dry brush and then a white dry brush over the top. So I started off priming each of these miniatures. Now, by doing this, of course, the grey Seer spray prime was the easiest and quickest one to prime out of this lot. Of course, you just grab the rattle can and you just spray away and it's basically done. The second 2 I both did with a matte black spray from Army Painter, getting that black primer on there first, nice solid coverage. Then I took one of them off and then I did the white Zenithal on one of them. Now, I did actually use grey Seer for this as well at a 45-degree angle all around the miniature for that Zenithal. Now, the reason why I used grey Seer over just going with like a Corax white or an Army Painter white was white spray paints are traditionally quite notorious for being very bad and very chalky. So after having some experience using the grey Seer primer for a couple of projects recently in the past, found it to be quite good. So I decided to use it for a Zenithal. And so it actually came up quite well. And so I opted to go with that one instead of just grabbing another white primer. I could have used white ink as well through the airbrush, but I wanted to save a bit of time. So this one, pretty quick to prime as well, as you just using 2 rattle cans. So if you're wanting something that's going to add some different depth that we'll get into in a little bit, definitely a solid option as well. And then for the final miniature that was already sprayed prime with the matte black, we did the traditional slapchop priming method to pick up all those details, where we used a dry brush of Dawnstone from Citadel for that mid-tone, and then we used white scarf for the higher points of the miniature as well. Now, this is the first time I've done slapchop as well, so I didn't get the technique 100% correct, which I do understand does have an impact on the painting, and it's a learning process when we go into that as well. So each of these 3 miniatures are primed in their different methods. Now, when I've finished priming and when I've come to actually wanting to start painting them, to keep things kind of simple, I actually only use a limited color palette for these guys, selecting only 5 different contrast paints, and I will list them in order that I'm going to be using them on the models for you guys. So we've got, for the flesh of the Von Ryan's Leapers, of the main parts of the flesh, you've got Sigvold Burgundy is the color I'm going to be using. We've got Arkellian Green, which to be honest is more like a stronger blue with some green accents. For the Chitin, so the armored parts of the Von Ryan's Leapers, we've got the Black Templar, which is for like the feet, the scything talons, any smaller scythe elements on them as well. We've got Guilliman Flesh, which I'm going to be using in 2 coats for some of the more exposed flesh areas, particularly on their overhead scythes. We're actually going to be doing the innards of those with the Guilliman Flesh, and having 2 coats over there gave it a really nice finish, which I'm quite happy with. And then Nazdrag Yellow for any basing elements that 2 of the 3 had. So now my approach to painting these, rather than just doing one color on all of them and batch painting style, I did it in individual models. So I actually went through and did every single color to completion on the model before I actually moved on to the next priming method, which allowed me to get a solid understanding of how that model looks with that priming method and contrast paints on top of it. Now, I will also say that whilst this is the first proper time I'm using contrast paints, it does add to the time because I'm still trying to get my head around how to best use them. Do I need to water them down? Do I need to use contrast medium to thin them down, or just water? All those kind of things I'm figuring out during this process. That there's lots of other content out there that you can look at to find out more about those. I won't really be covering that here, but I'll share my thoughts in a second as we start painting up some of these miniatures. So first up, I'll be starting by painting the Grey Seer primed Von Ryan Leaper. Now, as I go painting this miniature, I was quite careful to not get any of the contrast paint on areas that I didn't want to go on, so it was mostly successful doing that. There's some paint in different areas, but that was basically my approach. I was being quite careful. It took me about 2.5 hours to paint up this first miniature, and so really getting into it, I loved the use of the colors. The colors definitely worked for what I was aiming for. I didn't add in some of the colors that like Guilliman Flesh wasn't on this model, but I kind of saw the results without using it. Now, even after only painting the flesh and the chitin, I already found that I did not like this priming method due to just the way the colors settled and the overall look of the Von Ryan Leaper after this priming method. However, I did press on and completed it, and sure enough, even when it was fully completed, the Grey Seer primer I found to be too bright. It was really stark, and so what that meant was, even in the shadows where the paint settled, it acted more like a mid-tone, and everywhere else was just really bright and really punchy. So I wasn't really too much of a fan of the Grey Seer primer. So I already know that we can eliminate that from the options that we're potentially going to be using for our orcs going forward. Then leave it a little bit of time. I have a lot of other stuff going on, and I come back and I'm finally able to paint up the next Von Ryan's Leaper using the Zenithal priming method. So I follow the exact same painting order and methodology, but quite a bit quicker than what it was on the first miniature, because I understand how the contrast paint works. I thinned it down a little bit more, and I was able to get nice coverage across all parts of the miniature. Now, as I'm painting this one up, I'm already liking the look of it so much more than the Grey Seer Prime, as the Prime and the Zenithal is actually doing a lot more work to allow the color to look more natural, whilst also creating shadows where you'd expect the color to settle and where you'd expect them to be on the miniature on the outer facing areas. However, there is a downside that I found to this method, which is that when you use a Zenithal over a black undercoat, it means anywhere that isn't hit by that that Zenithal, as you're spraying it, won't show too much color with contrast paints because they're not opaque. They're designed to be translucent, and so it won't really work that well over black. And so what I found was a lot of the underside of the miniature that didn't really get hit by the Zenithal was quite dark, very, very low hints of the color coming through over the black as well. So it really didn't work out that well on that side of the model. So having found that there's that issue when doing a Zenithal, of course, the miniatures were fully assembled when I was doing this as well. I wasn't doing it in sub-assemblies. So it doesn't overall detract from it being a successful priming method for contrast paints. It's just something to be aware of, that it is going to create quite a stark difference in the outer faces of the model that does get a hit a lot more with that Zenithal rather than the underside parts of the miniature. It's really good for like models that are quite open, for example. So a lot of the Orc boys that I potentially working with that don't have shooters, you know, they're the old Assault on Black Reach style where they've got sluggers and choppers. Zenithal would work great on those. But the guys with the shooters, a lot of the parts hidden by the shooters would be quite hidden and a lot more muted. So that is something to bear in mind when I'm looking to potentially choose this option for priming the Orc army. But overall, I definitely say it's a strong option if you want a method that's going to provide a great result on the exterior of the model that you're seeing and not necessarily the underside that you're not seeing, without spending a ton of time priming the miniatures. Then we come to the final miniature out of the three, which is the slapchop primed method. Now, similar to the Zenithal primed miniature, I found that the areas that were hit with the gray and the white dry brush allowed the contrast paints to behave in a much more natural way, creating shadows and midtones and highlighted areas as the technique suggests. Now, similar to the Zenithal Prime miniature, as I was painting this one up, I found that there were areas that were hit with the gray and the white dry brush, allowed the contrast paints to actually behave in a more natural way. You could see where the shadows were, you could see where the highlights were in those mid-tones in the tonality as you applied the paint, which is really, really nice. So you had those different areas that the technique allows for. However, whilst it was similar, it also wasn't as widespread over the miniature as the Zenithal Prime. Now, what this resulted in is that the shadow areas were a lot larger than likely what they should have been. And also the midtones weren't as prominent and the highlights were very prominent. So what this means is probably I wasn't doing a sufficient slap chop job on the priming of it with that gray. Now, I did also find the same issue on the underside of the miniature as the Zenithal Prime. However, with the slap chop method, it wasn't to the same extent, was because I was able to get under there and get the dry brush on there. Of course, you don't want to hit too much of those shadow areas if you want that depth of color, but at the same time, with contrast paints being translucent, you want to see some of that color. So even just a gray on that underside really did help to bring out some of those colors there as well, which I really did appreciate, and a little bit of those highlights in there too. However, what I do really like about the slap chop method is how smooth the color transitions are between the shadows to the midtones to the highlights, which means, you know, you've got that natural transition that you don't really see in the Zenithal because it's just white all over, or maybe lower parts of the model you see that, whereas, you know, maybe you want that on the chin, and so you see that gradually transition from a shadow into a midtone into the highlight, rather than being, okay, this is what is most exposed to the sun, so this is going to be mostly highlight with a little bit of shadow in the creases of the chin where the plates mesh, where the paint's rested. So that's something that I really enjoyed about this. Now, after completing the slap chopped miniature, I do quite like the look overall, the way that it presents, and likely, as I've said, the limitations or the issues that I found with it is probably not down to the technique, but more user error. So I've got got some thoughts after doing each of these three. I really enjoyed using the translucent paint of the contrast, and I enjoyed how it worked. Obviously, I've worked with tinting before on my Necrons, and so I'm used to that kind of technique where you work with kind of a white or a gray undertone, and then you use the contrast paints to really tint, like what you would with metallics, where you work with a silver and then you use washes over the top to get different colored effects, which I really like the look of. So it's good to see that used through contrast. Also, you could use speed paints from Army Painter or express paints from Vallejo to do similar things, as well as the contrast paints if you're not a fan of Citadel paints. As I've said at the start, the reason why I'm testing this is for the Orc army. So the Orcs are almost done. I've got maybe about half dozen to a dozen that I still need to clean up their mold lines, do their bases, and then they're ready to go. So I'm really wanting to be ready to go for the rest of the videos that I want to work on. So after doing the 3 different test models in the Von Ryan's Leapers and doing a ton of research as well by looking at other content creators and seeing what tests they've done, which have been really great, I believe I've landed on the priming method I'm going to use for my Orcs, and I can't wait to test it out on one of them, but you're going to have to wait until the next video in this series to actually see the method that I've decided upon doing. I'm going to leave you hanging a little bit here, guys, so you're going to have to come back for the next From Sprue to Tabletop video to see what that priming method is and the results of that when we actually do a test of the color scheme on one of the Orcs for this small Orc force. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, well, I hope that you enjoyed today's video. I know it's been a hot minute since we've done a From Sprue to Tabletop video, but I really do enjoy these ones, and these ones do take a lot of time. Hobby time is a bit of a premium at the moment for me, so it means that when I do have to focus on videos, it does take a little bit more time. And of course, we've had a ton of tournament coverage and stuff recently, so really had to focus on that side of things, but I'm keen to jump back into the From Sprue to Tabletop side of content and continue to showcase some of the different experimentations I'm doing in my hobbying as I further develop my skills and share my thoughts and experience with you guys as well. If you enjoyed today's video, ladies and gentlemen, feel free to hit it with a like. If you have any feedback or any thoughts on your own on the different priming methods or other methods that I could potentially try it as well, feel free to leave it down in the comment section below. If you haven't already, feel free to hit that subscribe button, turn on that notification bell to be notified as to when we are creating more content here at the ATWN, whether that's tournament coverage, tournament previews, the Australian ITC South Pacific snapshots, whole bunch of other content that we've got for you guys coming up this year as well. And if you do want to hang out with me live, ask me questions whilst I'm doing hobbying and such as well, feel free to head over to Twitch, follow us at the ATWN Twitch channel, where you can join us for hobbying sessions every week, and it's also where we do our tournament preview streams when we are covering a tournament. So best place to catch those. You can always ask questions and such in chat. I'm always happy to chat hobby tips, tricks, all that fun stuff that maybe we don't cover in this video series as well. But ladies and gentlemen, I've been ScottyD. Hope you've enjoyed today's video, and I'll catch you in the next one.